A plan to strike at the heart of the United States was developed, but by the time it was ready to be executed, it was too late in the war for Japan to make a significant impact. The idea was sparked as early as April 1942 when Colonel James Doolittle led a daring raid of B-25 bombers over Tokyo. This attack shocked the Japanese leadership, who immediately sought to retaliate. However, by 1944, American bombing raids on Japan had become routine, devastating its cities and industrial centers. Despite this, Japan continued looking for ways to strike back against the United States in a way that would change the course of the war. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had finally reached a stage where they were prepared to launch an ambitious attack on American territory, surpassing even the infamous strike on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. After extensive consideration, strategic targets like New York City, San Francisco, San Diego, and Washington, D.C. were ruled out. Instead, Japanese leadership identified a more vulnerable and crucial target, the Panama Canal. This vital waterway allowed the United States to quickly transport military supplies between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, eliminating the need to navigate around the southern tip of South America. If Japan could disable the canal, it would severely hinder the movement of American forces and resources. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, devised the plan to cripple the canal. His vision was to use specially designed aircraft launched from submarines to carry out the attack. These submarines, known as the Sentoku or I-400 series, were the largest ever built at the time and remained unmatched in size for many years. The name Sentoku was derived from the term Sunken, meaning secret attack submarine. In the middle of 1942, Yamamoto made two key predictions about the war. He foresaw that Japan would eventually be devastated by relentless American bombing campaigns, and he also believed that Japan needed a way to strike American soil directly in retaliation. To execute this vision, he conceived a fleet of 18 massive underwater aircraft carriers, each capable of carrying attack bombers to their targets. Every I-400 submarine was designed to transport 3 Aichi M6 Sarin floatplanes. Initially, Yamamoto had intended for each submarine to carry only 2 aircraft, but as the plan developed, the capacity was increased. However, before his vision could be fully realized, Yamamoto was killed by American P-38 Lightning fighters over Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. Just 1 week after his death, on April 25, 1943, construction of the Sentoku fleet began at the Kure Naval Arsenal. Without Yamamoto to champion the project, the ambitious plan struggled to gain momentum. By this time, the war was turning against Japan, and delays plagued the construction process from the outset. The first prototype, the I-400, was finally completed and entered service on December 30, 1944. Shortly after, work began on the I-401 and I-402 at the Sasebo Naval Arsenal in Nagasaki. However, these facilities were frequently targeted by American bombers. Despite their efforts, U.S. forces were unaware of the massive submarines being built beneath them, and their attacks inflicted minimal damage on the secretive project. On January 8, 1945, the I-401 was completed and put into service, followed by the I-402 6 months later on July 24, 1945. These submarines formed the foundation of Submarine Division I, which was expected to play a decisive role in the war. However, Japan's ambitious plans were overtaken by events. By the time the war ended in August 1945, only 3 of the 18 planned submarines, the I-400, I-401, and I-402, had been completed. The I-404 and I-405 were still under construction, while the remaining submarines in the I-403 to I-417 series were never built. Instead, Japan shifted its focus to 2 smaller submarines, the I-13 and I-14, which were designed with similar objectives but on a reduced scale. These colossal submarines were unlike anything the world had seen before. They were nearly 60% larger than any American submarine, a record that remained unbroken until the advent of nuclear submarines. The most valuable asset of these submarines was the aircraft they carried. The idea of launching reconnaissance planes from surfacing submarines had been developed by Japan long before the war. The I-400 series, nicknamed the Sea Beasts, were 400 feet long, with a draft of 23 feet and a beam of 39 feet. Their double-hull design was so advanced that Soviet engineers later used it as inspiration for their own submarine fleet decades later. Each submarine was powered by 4 diesel engines, producing a total of 7,700 horsepower. When surfaced, the submarines weighed 5,223 tons, increasing to 6,560 tons when submerged. A retractable snorkel system was installed to allow the crew to breathe fresh air while remaining underwater for extended periods. This feature also expelled dangerous diesel fumes, reducing the risk of detection. These submarines had an astonishing operational range of 37,500 miles without refueling, allowing them to reach any target on the planet. However, their speed was relatively modest. They could travel at 18 knots on the surface and only 6 knots underwater. They were capable of diving to depths of 330 feet and had a crew capacity of 140 to 220 sailors. Despite their size, the I-400 submarines provided surprising luxuries for their crews. A walk-in freezer allowed them to store perishable food items, a rarity for submarines at the time. However, life on board was still challenging, with only 1 toilet per submarine and a limited supply of fresh water, which was rationed and mostly available only during mealtimes. In terms of armament, these submarines were heavily equipped. They carried 8 forward torpedo tubes, capable of firing 20 Type 95 torpedoes. Additionally, they were armed with one 25mm single-barrel anti-aircraft gun and 3 25mm triple-barrel guns mounted on the deck. A much larger 140mm cannon provided further firepower. One of the most unique features of the I-400 class was a slide that allowed sailors to evacuate the deck quickly in case of an emergency. Instead of climbing down ladders, they could slide down a chute into a padded landing area, cutting evacuation time in half. The design of these submarines also included a major structural quirk. The conning tower was offset to the right, rather than being centrally positioned. This adjustment was made to accommodate the waterproof hangar, which was 115 feet long and 12 feet wide. Inside, 3 Aichi M6 Sarin aircraft were stored, specially built for these submarines by the Aichi Aircraft Company in Nagoya. The hangar was located next to an 80-foot pneumatic catapult, used to launch the aircraft. Each Sarin aircraft required a 2-person crew consisting of a pilot and a gunner. The gunner was seated at the rear, operating a 12.7mm Type II machine gun. To save space in the submarine, the wings and tail of the aircraft could be folded along the fuselage. Instead of traditional landing gear, the Sarin used detachable floats. It was capable of carrying various bomb configurations, including 2 551-pound bombs, a single 1,764-pound bomb, or a massive 1,874-pound bomb. By July 1945, only 28 Sarin aircraft had been produced, 16 fewer than the original target. These aircraft were designed specifically to strike the continental United States. Various targets were considered, including major West Coast cities and even Washington, D.C. The Panama Canal was also a potential target, as its destruction would have been a major blow to American military logistics. However, before any attacks could be launched, Japan's war situation deteriorated further. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa outlined the I-400's objectives, but the war ended before the submarines could carry out their mission. Operation PX was a clandestine initiative that stemmed from the work of Japan's infamous Unit 731, a covert biological warfare research division. As soon as Japan gained control over parts of the Asian continent, a large and permanent facility for Unit 731 was established in Harbin, Manchuria. This complex, disguised as a water treatment plant, was dedicated to the study of biological and germ warfare, conducting gruesome experiments on thousands of civilian and military prisoners of war. In the early months of 1945, Japan devised a plan to launch a biological attack against American civilians. The operation aimed to deploy 4 submarines, designated as I-400, I-401, I-13, and I-14, to sail toward the western coast of the United States. Once positioned, they were to release ceramic canister bombs filled with flea-bearing rats infected with deadly diseases such as cholera, typhus, and the plague. These pathogens were intended to spread rapidly across the United States, inflicting mass casualties and creating widespread panic. This strategy was inspired by prior biological attacks against China, which had yielded effective results. San Diego, California, was selected as the primary target. In addition to this, a separate plan was formulated to strike the Panama Canal, a key strategic point that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The idea for the canal attack was conceived by 2 individuals from vastly different backgrounds. One was a Japanese national who had previously worked on the canal and willingly provided Japanese officials with extensive notes, designs, and strategic information. The other was an American soldier who had been imprisoned at a notorious Japanese PO boat camp near Yokohama. He had served near the Panama Canal before the war and, upon capture, was brutally interrogated about its defenses. His captors learned that as the war progressed and Japan began losing ground, the number of guards overseeing the canal had significantly decreased. This intelligence convinced Japanese planners that the canal was vulnerable and could be targeted with relative ease. The proposed attack on the Panama Canal was set in motion on December 15, 1944, when planning officially commenced. 2 weeks later, on December 30, the Imperial Japanese Navy formed the 631st Air Wing, tasked with executing the mission. This unit consisted of 30 combat experienced pilots who were trained under a doctrine that prioritized repeated assaults over suicide missions. Their training took place at Toyama Bay in the Sea of Japan, where a full-scale replica of the canal's locks was constructed. However, training was plagued with setbacks. Aircraft were delivered slowly, accidents claimed lives, and persistent attacks from American naval and air forces disrupted preparations. On January 23, 1945, the 631st Air Wing was relocated to the Naval Yard at Kure. Within 2 weeks, they moved again to Yashirojima. Meanwhile, the submarines that were integral to the operation faced their own challenges. The I-400, docked at Kure, sustained minor damage during an air raid. The I-41 and I-13 managed to escape unscathed by heading out to sea, while the I-14 was already on a mission. By early February, American B-29 bombers began laying sea mines in the inland waterways, making the path for the submarine squadron increasingly treacherous. The relentless American bombardment took a toll on Japanese forces, who struggled to maintain operational readiness. By March 26, 1945, Japanese Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu decided to cancel the biological warfare plan. He reasoned that given America's overwhelming military advantage, the risks of retaliation far outweighed the potential gains. Furthermore, the war's trajectory had shifted significantly. Germany was on the verge of defeat in Europe, and Japan faced mounting losses. If the Allies triumphed in Europe, it was only a matter of time before their full strength would be redirected to the Pacific. To prolong the war and potentially force better surrender terms, Japan's military leadership refocused efforts on delaying Allied advances by targeting strategic infrastructure like the Panama Canal. Despite the cancellation of the biological warfare plan, the mission to attack the canal remained active. The plan involved the 4 submarines carrying specialized aircraft that would be assembled and launched mid-ocean. The planes were to fly undetected toward the canal, drop their bombs on key structures, and return to rendezvous with their submarines. The pilots were instructed to ditch their aircraft near their submarines, where they would be retrieved before heading back to Japan. Japanese strategists believed that if the attack succeeded, it could disrupt American supply lines and prolong the war for several months, if not years. However, before this plan could be put into action, the Battle of Okinawa erupted on April 1, 1945. Okinawa was considered the gateway to the Japanese mainland, and its defense became the empire's top priority. As American forces landed on the island, Japanese command realized that a full-scale invasion of the home islands was imminent. At the time, The submarine squadron had reached Fukuyama near Hiroshima, but encountered severe fuel shortages, further delaying their operations. On April 14, the I-400 successfully returned from Darren, Manchuria with 1,700 tons of fuel. Meanwhile, the I-13 and I-14 were dispatched to Korea to procure additional fuel supplies. During one of these operations, the I-401 struck a sea mine and sustained damage, forcing it to return to port for repairs. The commander of Submarine Squadron 1, Captain Tatsunashuk Arizumi, had a controversial reputation. He had previously captained the I-8, a vessel notorious for its ruthless actions against enemy survivors. Under his command, captured Allied sailors and civilians were often executed rather than taken as prisoners. His brutal tactics had been exposed when American forces rescued survivors of the Dutch cargo ship SS Giselak, who provided first-hand accounts of his war crimes. Arizumi's plan for the Panama Canal bore similarities to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. The submarines were to navigate a northern Pacific route, bypassing Hawaii, and then head south toward the coast of Ecuador. From there, the strike planes would take off, cross the Caribbean, and bomb the canal before returning to their submarines. The planners hoped this mission would cripple the Allied war effort and delay their advance into Japan. As the war continued, however, Japan's strategic situation deteriorated rapidly. On June 21, 1945, after 82 days of intense fighting, the Battle of Okinawa ended in an American victory. Attention now turned to the Ulithi Atoll, a remote Pacific island that had become a critical American naval base. The atoll, spanning just 2 square miles of land but encompassing 210 square miles of deep water harbor, was seized by the U.S. Navy on September 20, 1944. It was quickly transformed into a major logistics hub, complete with an airstrip, a hospital, and a desalination plant. The base's primary role was to support the final push toward Japan. Despite initial plans to carry out the Panama Canal attack in September 1945, the mission was rendered obsolete when the war took a decisive turn. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 forced Japan to surrender unconditionally on September 2, 1945. The war ended before Operation PX or the Canal attack could be executed, leaving them as chilling reminders of the extreme lengths Japan was willing to go to alter the course of the war. In the aftermath, many details of these secret operations remain classified for years. The idea that Japan had actively considered biological warfare against civilian populations and infrastructure highlighted the desperation and strategic recklessness of the final months of the war. Had these plans been executed, they could have caused untold devastation and prolonged the conflict even further. The collapse of these schemes ultimately underscored the overwhelming military and industrial dominance of the Allies, sealing Japan's fate in the Pacific War. The Pacific Ocean in the summer of 1945 was a vast battlefield where the final moves of the war were unfolding. More than 20 aircraft carriers formed the backbone of the American Navy, each serving a unique purpose. The Japanese, aware that an attack on their home islands was inevitable, sought to delay the American advance by launching a powerful strike. Their only hope was to inflict massive damage on the American fleet, particularly at strategic locations like Ulithi Atoll, which served as a crucial staging ground for Allied operations. A daring plan to breach the Panama Canal had been previously devised, but was once again set aside in favor of a more immediate and devastating objective. On June 12, 1945, the Japanese command issued orders that all training would be focused on targeting Ulithi. The men aboard the submarines did not yet realize how little time remained for their mission. The I-13 and I-14 submarines, which had been equipped with the powerful Sarin torpedo bombers, were ordered to swap them for the less potent Nakajima C-6N1 reconnaissance planes. These long-range observation aircraft were expected to gather crucial intelligence for the upcoming attack. Once their mission was complete, they would return to their home port and relay the information to Truk Island, a site that had long been fortified by the Japanese since their occupation in 1919. Truk was often compared to Pearl Harbor or Ulithi in terms of its strategic importance. It had been transformed into a deep water port, a staging area for future operations. 4 reconnaissance planes were deployed to gather intelligence, while 6 bombers were designated to conduct the attack itself. In a deceptive effort to confuse the American forces, the Japanese painted their aircraft with American insignias and colors, making them resemble the P-51 Mustang fighters from a distance. The hope was that this disguise would allow them to close in on their target undetected before delivering their deadly payload. The I-13 submarine, carrying 2 Nakajima C-6 and 1 and 2 Aichi M6A1 Sarin aircraft, departed from Aminato on July 11, setting a course for Truk. However, the mission was compromised when, just 5 days later, an American TBF Avenger torpedo bomber from the aircraft carrier U.S. Anzio detected the I-13. The destroyer escort U.S. Lawrence C. Taylor immediately moved in and launched a relentless attack, eventually sinking the submarine on July 16. Despite this setback, the remaining submarines, I-400, I-401, and I-14, continued with their plan. They were supposed to rendezvous and launch a synchronized attack on Ulithi. But a violent typhoon on July 28 and 29 disrupted their communications. The I-400 found itself separated from the others, and an unaccompanied American tanker even crossed paths with the I-401. The submarine remained undetected, allowing it to continue its mission. When the I-14 arrived at Truk on August 4, it unloaded the reconnaissance aircraft as American forces continued their aggressive patrols. Captain Arizumi, commanding the submarine squadron, kept his remaining vessels updated with the latest information and remained determined to proceed with the attack. However, before the Japanese submarines could strike, the course of history changed. On August 6 and 9, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was unimaginable, and Japan had no choice but to surrender. On August 14, Emperor Hirohito issued a royal decree ordering all Japanese military forces, on land, sea, and air, to immediately cease hostilities and surrender to Allied authorities. The submarines, which had been just days away from launching their assault, were suddenly ordered to abandon their mission. As a symbol of surrender, all Japanese naval vessels were instructed to raise a black flag when operating on the surface. Despite the Emperor's order, the commanders and crew of the submarines were in disbelief. Many refused to accept that Japan had lost the war. Their mission had been everything to them, and now they were expected to give up without a fight. Confusion and reluctance spread among the officers, who hesitated to return home under such circumstances. They had spent years preparing for battle, and the sudden shift in orders left them feeling lost. On August 18, orders were issued for the 3 remaining submarines to make their way back to Japan at maximum speed while avoiding any encounters with Allied forces. They were instructed to comply with any orders given by American naval vessels, but deep down, many of the crew members did not trust the directives. As they traveled home, the submarines were also ordered to destroy all evidence of their mission. On August 26, all 3 submarines fired their remaining aircraft into the ocean, ensuring that no American forces would ever discover what had been planned. Explosives and torpedoes were also discarded, sinking into the deep waters. Maps, journals, notes, and classified documents were burned, erasing all traces of their objectives. The secrecy surrounding the mission would remain intact, leaving the Americans unaware of just how close they had come to facing a deadly assault. The next day, American naval pilot Lieutenant Robert Mahoney, flying a TBF Avenger from the U.S. Bennington, spotted the I-401 and I-14. He observed their movements, initially uncertain of their intentions. Mahoney signaled the submarines, attempting to communicate, but the Japanese commanders did not respond. Frustrated, Mahoney made another pass, giving a universal hand gesture indicating that they should change course. When they failed to comply, he resorted to a more aggressive signal, shaking his fist, a universally understood sign of disapproval. Finally, the Japanese submarines acknowledged his presence and altered their course. On August 29, the American submarine U.S. Segundo closed in on the I-401, while destroyers U.S. Dashiell and U.S. Murray pursued the I-14. Commander Kusaka of the I-401 eventually surrendered, realizing that resistance was futile. Meanwhile, the destroyers U.S. Blue and U.S. Mansfield intercepted the I-400. As the American forces surrounded the massive submarine, tensions were high. The Americans suspected that the Japanese might attempt a final act of defiance, especially since a large number of crew members were gathered near the deck gun. The Japanese, however, were merely observing the American ships with curiosity and had no hostile intentions. Ultimately, the captain of the I-400 complied with the orders and surrendered. Captain Arizumi, knowing that his involvement in previous war crimes would lead to his arrest and trial, chose to take his own life rather than face disgrace. On August 30, he retreated to his quarters and shot himself. His crew buried him at sea, honoring him in the traditional Japanese way. When American sailors boarded the captured submarines, they were amazed at the advanced technology and engineering of the vessels. Communication between the Japanese officers and their captors was relatively smooth, as many Japanese naval officers had been trained in English. The Americans, clean-shaven and dressed in immaculate uniforms, were starkly different from the weary Japanese sailors who had spent weeks at sea. The submarines were taken to Japan, which was now under American occupation. The U.S. Navy, recognizing the significance of these advanced submarines, decided to transport them to Hawaii in complete secrecy. There, they conducted extensive studies on the I-400 class. However, post-war agreements required that all captured technology be shared with allied nations, including the Soviet Union. To prevent this, the Americans deliberately sank the submarines after extracting all valuable data. In 2005, remnants of the I-400 were discovered deep in the Pacific, a silent reminder of the secret mission that never came to be.